I think that's incredible. I may end up cutting this back up to the front just because we jumped into the conversation. This notion that, you can look the patient in the eye and then have that conversation automatically generated into a note that represents how you like to have notes done.
Well, that's our secret sauce in the background
Okay.
there. Essentially, the chatbot plus some of our own software is doing that prompt engineering in the middle.
Okay.
One of the things that we always say to people is it's really hard to imagine how great this technology is, even out of the box. Obviously we want to create all this customization, but out of the box, this technology is, it's Lord of the Rings grade special and surprising. I think that what we would say to, your listeners and your audience is, you can try Jot Psych for free for 7 days without swiping a credit card. Experience the wave of the future. Experience what it's like to have a full-time scribe who never sleeps and never leaves you for medical school, and and takes feedback very earnestly. So that's the best way to kind of see what we're building and to to get engaged with it.
Today's podcast is with Nate Peereboom and Jackson Bierfeldt from SmartScribe, an early startup building value for doctors and patients by using AI to streamline the medical documentation process. Let's get straight to it. Welcome. So, we got Nate and Jackson from SmartScribe. And we were just saying before we got on how pleased we all are to finally have gotten this done and to be all together. I think we all pretty excited about this. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, Zane, you were a good sport about letting us cancel last time because of that product emergency. So thank you.
Believe me, I understand that when it's all hands on deck.
We're an early stage startup, and we sometimes have early stage startup problems that required rebooting the server in the middle of the day and getting things smoothed out for people as fast as possible. So thanks for the flexibility.
Yeah, my first patients, I think, would agree. I started, River Rock in 2013 with I think I had a desk and a sofa, and that was all that was in a room. And then as I added things on, I think every single thing I've added onto the practice has malfunctioned the first time a patient tried it. I pre-tested, I tested it on myself, I made sure I knew the process, and then the minute I got a patient in the room, it went haywire the first few times. So
one of the things that we've found really cool about just working in medical technology is that so many medical professionals are themselves entrepreneurs. There are so many people who have started these practices where it was just them and their desktop and, and a couch, and they've built this universe for themselves. And so there's a kinship with doctors and nurse practitioners who have done that. We really admire kind of going out on your own in kind of the way you have, which to Jackson's point earlier is super unique. I mean, one of the questions I had when we got this on the calendar was just how did you come to, and I know that you're the interviewer, but I just have to know how did you come to dream-driven healthcare? I mean, it's such a unique approach.
Man, I was hoping I would help you guys market, but you're helping me market. That's actually the right question in some way. So in medical school, I went to an osteopathic medical school. So, and part of the reason I did that is because I agree with the philosophy, or the overt philosophy, at least in practice. Functionally, osteopathic is not any different, but at least there's some lip service to another philosophy. And the founder, one of his famous quotes is that the role of a physician should be to find health. Any idiot can find disease. And so that got me thinking okay, cool. Sounds good. But what is health? And the more I thought about that, I was like, well, it's got to be individually defined, because, if somebody wants to be an Olympic marathon runner, we know that has negative impacts on longevity and heart health and all these things, because the excessive degree of exercise passes the limits of those things. But that's the dream, right? You're not going to say, oh, well, you might live 4 years less, but you get Olympic gold. He's going to, 100%, I will trade off 4 years for, and so realizing that health has to be defined in the context of the patient's deepest dreams and what they find most meaningful in life. Otherwise, health has no meaning. There's no, or I'm imposing my values onto the patient, which is not ideal. I think that happens a lot in medicine. We say, well, we just assume you're after longevity, right? Or you're after less pain, or you're after. I think one of my best friends was a dancer for a number of years and developed a bone spur in the big toe of one of her feet, and it took her like 4 or 6 surgeon visits to tell someone, I'm not looking to reduce the pain. I want to dance. I don't care how much it hurts. So they kept offering to fuse the toe to reduce the pain, and she just couldn't get through. Like, that's not what I care about. I don't care how much it hurts, right? And dancers are kind of hardcore, and so she was like, "Yeah, I don't give a damn how much it hurts." So I think those experiences made me say, "Look, dreams are the drive for what we do. That's the definition. That sets the target, and then everything else is in service of how do we aim for that dream." And so that's the core of the practice. It's just so different that it's hard to communicate. Where
it's
is.
so interesting to think about it from that perspective too, because I mean, we're going to get into this, but like with AI, especially where it is right now, it's so consumed with statistics and the norm, and a lot of like medical practice is entirely consumed by finding those norms and adhering to those norms. But yeah, as you point out, every individual person, sometimes they don't want to be in the norm. They don't want to be, treated that way or find their way back to that middle road.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I have a video on my YouTube channel that was back when I was first starting to make videos. So the production quality is really bad. I need to remake it because it was a good point. A good point badly made. But if you look at something like hemoglobin, right? Well, there's the normal range for hemoglobin, right? But it's defined by, okay, you're male, okay, you're female, okay, you're female pregnant in the first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, you're male of a certain age, and you can start subdividing, right? But it's arbitrary. You can't subdivide too far, or you end up with everybody's hemoglobin's normal because there's one person in that group, right? Like, so there always has to be some comparator, right? And then if you look at, but it's weird because, like, okay, you take males, and I'm thinking of a particular patient. You take males, 45 years old, and there's a bell curve of normal, right? And we say, well, anything above the 99th or below the first percentile, that's abnormal. Well, but there is a condition called athletic pseudoanemia, where people exercise so intensely that their body tends to retain more volume to compensate for the fact that they get dehydrated when they're working out. So their body's actually adapted for the exercise state instead of adapted for the resting state. And so if you draw their blood, it looks like they're anemic, but they're not. It's actually a functional adaptation that improves performance and reduces risk. And so you compare that to you're like, okay, you're outside of normal, but making you normal would hurt you.
Yeah.
Right. Bringing you into the norm would be a bad thing. And there's a ton of examples like that where we've gotten into this very sort of like, hey, just push to the norm, right? Everything should be in the normal. And then we arbitrarily choose things where it's like, oh, well, but testosterone, I don't want to be in the norm. I want that to be on the high end, right? Just because we have a cultural narrative around that, right? So yeah, I think AI, maybe you guys can speak to how AI is playing into that.
Yeah, I mean, Jackson and I were just talking about this earlier, how, one of the things that you get with AI right now, I mean, we're in the early stages, but, most people, when they talk about AI, they're talking about large language models, which are essentially pattern recognition centered on this, on the center of the bell curve. And so the content that you get is going to be middle of the road content, and so people talk about this all the time when they use it as a writing aid. I mean, you're never going to get Ernest Hemingway from OpenAI. Like, you're not going to get that kind of writing. You're going to get, a solid A- high school or college paper, level kind of content from it right now. That's probably changing as you get more kind of subsystems, to your point of like you take a hemoglobin and you break it down demographically. Of course, if you do that recursively forever, then you get to just everyone has their own hemoglobin level. And therefore, if you're in a N of one group, you're always going to be the maximum, the minimum, the median, the average, the whole thing. But one thing that's happening in AI right now is that you're starting to see more subdivision that is scalable because you can create larger or you can create custom data sets in a way that you never could before. And so you are seeing some of that
more targeted subdivision too. It's not just like, oh, let's, put someone in this N of 10,000. N of 1's not useful. N of 10,000 isn't that useful. But if you can, on a case by case in an intelligent way, break it into, okay, what are those N of 100 where it is valuable there? If we can do the analysis inside of there and make it easy for the human that is responsible for doing that analysis to get to that point, we're finding that is kind of like where people are getting productivity gains, and they're also getting, outcome gains as well in the AI space with the current level of technology.
Yeah, and it's really cool to be kind of like on that edge right now. So our flagship product is called Jot Psych. It's a AI scribe specifically for folks in the behavioral health space. And you started out by saying, look, I have a philosophy of health that is kind of particular to me, Zane, which is driven by the aspirations and dreams of the patient, and there's like a psychosocial, perhaps even spiritual element that underlies all of that. And one thing within behavioral health is that those particular themes are really important because you have two actors in each of those encounters. You have the patient who has their understanding of of what their dreams are, and then you also have the provider who's sensitive to certain parts of the patient's narrative and kind of goals based on their own unique practice. And so one thing that we're building right now is the ability to customize your medical note based on the unique way your patients and you value some of those psychosocial and spiritual elements within within your within your therapy practice or within your psychiatric practice. And so we're kind of seeing just like the beginnings of a whole layer of technology that's going to allow for people, not just in medicine, but in all sorts of fields, to have like very glove fit. We talk about it on our team as like the 70 finger hand glove, where you just imagine like a really, really complex, almost like like this weird alien octopus, like everyone's glove actually fits differently for a lot of this software. And to be able to create that kind of customization is something that you just couldn't do before now. And so it's a really, really exciting time for people who are looking for more of that detail in the way that they practice medicine.
So we picked on, we got like 2 or 3 really deep threads there. So just, and we can come back to circle around, but so one was this notion, first of all, I think, AI, we talk about that, but there's several different, and I'm using several different, right? So Grail is using an AI to detect cancer, right? Cardio Diagnostics is using AI to predict heart disease, right? Now AI, in terms of the common parlance, we're talking about LLMs, right? And so so then within the LLM kind of space, then there's also this notion that I think most people don't get, that is that like you are going to get a very average response. You're not going to like, it is fundamentally looking for the most average response, and there is a utility in that. So something, for instance, like I use AI for generating YouTube descriptions, right? Because if I try to do it, it's going to end up at like it's going to be a 10,000 word thesis on all the stuff that didn't end up in the video or whatever, right? And so I want the most average YouTube description of this because that's what's going to appeal to the algorithm. That's going to, so I'm actually looking for that average, and it's very useful. But then we get to the notion of, okay, I want the average doctor's note. Okay, that's a subset, right? That's not the average note, that's the average doctor. And so, okay, or the average cardiologist. Okay, now we're getting even more specific, right? And so there is that segmenting. And is that training sets? How do you, maybe I can dive into that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, Jackson, do you want to take this one? You're the technical genius on our team here, not me.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're doing right now is we're kind of like coaching and coercing what is like that larger training model, mostly from GPT, but we're experimenting with new things. We're very excited about like the possibility of Gemini that was just announced recently from Google. Can't wait to get our hands on that and see what they've got working in their model. But what we're finding and what most people are doing at this stage in the technology stack is taking this thing that has been trained already and just finding out like, okay, that model has like a sense of the world inside of it. It has a sense of the cardiologist's world. It has a sense of the cardiologist practicing in Texas's world and the cardiologist that's working in a large hospital world. Like all of that is inside of that model. And then your job as an application developer at this stage is kind of bringing those models to salience, those different sub models that are like embedded in that. So what we're doing as application developers now is building software that makes it really easy for a particular user to find their sub world inside of that and then get output from it. In the future, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. Please finish the thought. Yeah, in the future.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's like what's going on right now. And in the grand scheme of things, it's so naive. It's very like technically complicated and we're getting good results from it. But in terms of like what's possible, it's all going to come down at some point to the data that is being trained on. Because the way that we, think about these models is they're kind of just like compressions of the world. Of knowledge, of text, of experience, of pattern recognition. You're just taking all of that data that exists in various forms. Is it text? Is it actual like knowledge locked away in someone? Is it in images? And these models are getting better at taking all that input in. But fundamentally, it's just compressing it into different things. And then your job is to somehow get in there and pull it out. But, the next couple phases of this technology are going to be based on better and better data, data that is explicitly tagged to say, hey, this is like actually a good cardiologist's assessment, versus this is a, less effective cardiologist's assessment, just rather than treating all that information equally and putting it in the model and having it just be like, what's the next word that's the most likely, somehow guiding that data by having it be tagged and having it be organized. That is all going to go into models that are even getting better and better at training and better at compressing. And, it's still the same fundamental technology, but we still see that there's like a lot of room to grow and to increase your outcomes there. And that data tagging is also speeding up. That's another thing, creating good data sets has been an extremely arduous process, up till now, all the stuff that's like, been trained on for current models, it's mostly just unstructured data that's out there and a couple really prime data sets that some research team spent hundreds and thousands of hours of like expert time training and tagging, building up over years. And there's only a couple of those. But right now we're in a situation where partially because of the utility of LLMs in that like data tagging and data capturing process, we're finding that like the data set explosion, that's just starting to happen now. We're kind of like in a Precambrian era where it's like, oh wait, now there's all this like data that's being generated and like really rich expressive data. And, when all of that goes back in and then the next layer of models gets built on top of that, we think that, that's just going to increase the quality and usefulness of all of this without even like getting into, what can really happen when we get to like that next technological leap. This is all just like within the paradigm that currently exists.
Yeah.
But by the way, great paleontology reference there, the Precambrian explosion.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, one of the cool things too is, people have been training AI models, even in the medical space, for a long period of time. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people were taking, radiology slides and just doing a simple, like, if it looks like this, it gets tagged to that. If it looks like this, and you can train that in this really consistent way. And there's not a lot of personalization in that. It's objective data. You can collect it really easily. You have a really like clear data set of the results. And so you could build AI like radiology readers, a decade ago. The difference is with what's happening now is the large language model functions in the same way that like a primary or high school or even college education functions for workers at this point. So, you imagine medical scribes. When you hire a human medical scribe, you're not training them from infancy. You're not training them from birth. You're assuming like, okay, they're high school, maybe they're preparing for medical school. Like all of that education has led them so that at the point that they walk into a medical office and get a job as a medical scribe, there's actually a fairly thin layer of training or fairly thin layer of data change that you need to impose on their own neurology to get them to then be this awesome, medical scribe. And what large language models did is it allowed you to move from that really absolute data creation to a space where all you need is that thin layer on top, in the same way that you only need a thin layer of kind of re-education, like for anyone who's starting a new position. And so the trick now is figuring out like, what is the most effective way to take that base and without kind of going back to the drawing board of creating a completely new data set, just creating enough training data. They call this like the few shot, method, where you're giving a few examples or you're giving a little bit of guidance, and that is sitting on top of all the context and the world compression that Jackson's speaking of. And that, if you had to like describe like the big change in usability of AI over the last year, that's the change, that you no longer have to like start from scratch in order to, work with AI.
That's a fascinating model of what the change has been. I don't think that's very eloquently put. Yeah, I can totally see that shift, right? Rather than a custom radiology AI that only applies there in that spell. That's interesting. I am curious, this notion. So picking up on what Jackson said, I guess I see two layers of, actually there's probably a third layer of engineering, right? So there's prompt engineering, where we're like saying, okay, this is the LLM. We're figuring out how to get it. What can we give it so that it gives us the output we want? But it's not changing, right? It is what it is. And there's even within that sort of contextualization. Okay, let me give you a role. You are a Texan cardiologist, whatever, and let me ask you this question in that context, whatever the prompt is. Then there is the engineering maybe of the LLM itself, right? And then there is the data set that it's trained on. And now I guess maybe I can piggyback on what you said, Nate, is even within that notion of the data set, there's the background data set, and then there's maybe the specificity, the thin layer of specificity. Is that at the data set layer? Is that, did I understand that correctly? Am I modeling that in my head correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you're building an actual application, which I think is what you're gesturing at, right? Like when you're taking the large language model, you're applying it to something. How are you injecting rules, concepts, data so that you're actually doing that top layer of specific training? Is that kind of what you're curious about?
Well, I guess that's kind of what. Yeah, maybe I'm sort of seeing is that I feel like there's ways to do that. Like, if I do that by adjusting the prompt, that's maybe different than doing that by training it, like a few shot training, right?
Yeah.
Those seem different to me, but
you're pointing at like the ultimate art versus science question of working with AI right now, which is like, we actually don't know. Like I don't have, and I don't actually know how, an objective set of theories or rules around how to, best improve the performance of an AI model, like how you balance prompt engineering versus data injection. I mean,
the answer is both.
You have to use both. You have to use both. I mean, there's some really funny stuff though that has worked, even though you're shocked that it works. Like we went through a period where we were engineering our model to take a deep breath in the middle of writing the medical note, because we found that just coaching a model to go and then write the note actually just improved like the medical information that it absorbed. So there's some like mysticism that is like built in here, just because you are working with human language, which is a totally like social and behavioral, data.
I think I just read an article that if you offer to tip ChatGPT for its answer, it gives you more extensive or better answers, but then refuses the tip afterward.
Yeah. The problem with our model is it was
yeah.
accepting the tip, for a little while. So we had to get rid of that because it just was our margins were going down rapidly.
It's a startup. I mean, yeah, you gotta watch the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
But absolutely. I mean, like in a technical way, we talk about this right now in the again, this is confined to the current landscape of developing on top of these large language models. You've got something that you would call, prompt engineering. And part of prompt engineering is not just, the prompt. It's not just the thing that you're typing into the ChatGPT box, telling it what to do. Part of that is also just getting the contextual information that you want it to be sensitive to with it as well. So, prompt engineering includes not just giving it instructions, but also how and in what way and how much and how detailed of information you're giving it and telling it to think about, because that's the main way that people are building applications. And then on the data side of things, that deeper underlayer that you're talking about, there is, of course, training your own model. And some people are doing that, people who have access to large amounts of data. And that is going to be some of the next big foundational models are going to be trained on this better data that we were talking about. But there's this thing in the middle called fine tuning, where you take, and this is getting to what Nate was saying about that thin layer. They're actually at the neural net level is this idea where you take this model that has, let's just say 17 layers of things that it's doing, where it's these neurons are passing to this one, and you take 16 of those and keep them the same way. I'm not going to change any of those. I'm just going to change that last little layer, or I'm going to add another one on top of it, where I'm just doing a little bit of that neural net training, with my own particular data set. And I'm not changing the foundational model too much. I'm just putting one more layer at the end right before it gets to the output. And then I'm prompt engineering on top of that. And that's where the best results are, is when you take a good foundational model that knows a lot about the entire world, because it's important for it to know a lot about the entire world, as Nate pointed out, maybe you are just specifically, looking at a certain picture and saying is this pathological or not? But it is helpful if it somehow knows deep in the background about school buses. We don't really know how that actually fits into it, but those kinds of things do matter at a certain level. So you take that and then you fine tune its engineering, and then you prompt on top of that, and dealing with all three of those layers. That's how you improve the performance of software at this point. And then I would say also there is also a fourth layer, which is the user experience and the actual software, because at this point we're talking about software that humans are using. We are not at the point, and I would even say this is something I want to talk about later, when we even want to talk about where humans fit in. But let's just assume that we're in this world, and I think we are in this world, where we don't want humans out of the loop, especially in medical contexts. The way that we think about this still very much is that you see a healthcare provider who is a certified flesh and blood human being, and they are using these AI tools as tools to help them do their job. That's the phase we're in right now. And, the software we're building is squarely in that. Our mission is to help healthcare providers spend less time on the stuff that they shouldn't be spending time on, and spending more time on the stuff, the patient care. And a big part of that is making these tools easy to use, easy to, customize. And that's where everything is right now in this space, is it's all about this customization. We were talking about those different worlds and how they're embedded in there. And part of that is helping a user through the software find that world for themselves, because we have psychiatrists that are using this, and not all psychiatrists are the same. Some of them work with a patient population that is, dealing with substance abuse problems mostly. Some of them are dealing with a patient population that's mostly about anxiety or ADHD. Some of them have to jump between all of those. And what we're trying to do with our software is make it so that you can come in with your own background, your own priors, your patient population, and your preferences as a provider. because every provider learns to do things in a certain way. They like to do things in a certain way. And we want you to bring all that and then interact with our software in a very natural way. We don't want you, we have this EHR problem. Everyone in healthcare is aware of you open up Epic and there's 25,000 menus and customizations and tools and drop downs, and you click 500 times in order to do something. Yeah, you are getting to a certain level of customization there, but how much time are you spending learning Epic and learning,
Mm-hmm.
where that is? And sorry to pick on Epic here. I hope you're not listening, Epic. But this is
no. I hope you are listening, Epic, and your awful selection of menus that has gotten. Sorry, I used Epic in 2011 when they first pretty early, and I feel like it's gotten progressively worse. I'm still using them.
Yeah,
and the usability has declined year over year, I think.
As the features just grow. Yeah, no, it's a common problem with software. So this is what we're thinking about. That's this fourth layer that I think about, which is how do you as the human interact with the tool in order to get all of that benefit of the artificial intelligence? That's all the way deep down there. So that's something that we think about a lot.
To your point, I mean, even my sort of homegrown rustic implementation, saves a massive amount of time, right? And I am curious. I kind of want to dive in a little bit here because it's interesting that your first area is psych. I do, as you might imagine, doing dream driven. I do a ton of psychological work with my patients. I have a very opinionated view of psych, which differs from standard psychology as I've experienced it, at least, and as I was taught. Um, and I'm much more. I have a different focus, maybe, right? So my focus is on the subjective experience of meaningfulness and enhancing that. That's one of the big drives and identity creation and enhancement. So there's aspects of philosophy there. There's aspects of psychology, obviously, but I'm definitely not doing the sort of, I don't know how much y'all have gotten into psych, but like the Rogerian sort of I'll just sit and listen and validate. There, I sit and challenge, and I'm like, hey, we need to figure out what you find meaningful, and then start implementing actions that will enhance that sense of meaning, right? So I drive very aggressively toward a specific plan of meaning enhancement, right? And the reason that's challenging is that I also do procedures like PRP, and I also have standard, oh, hey, I have this, colon problem and I need to coordinate between colorectal surgery and whatever, right? And so the specificity, it's well, when I have my meaning and purpose hat on, that's very different than when I have my internal medicine hat or my proceduralist hat. And so maybe you guys can speak to this notion of and tying it maybe even back a little bit with Jot Psych and that stuff is when you guys are engineering the user experience to switch maybe or adjust, is that at the prompt level, or are you injecting, are you choosing injections or both?
Yeah. So we have multiple layers of pathing for what you're describing. The first and kind of most obvious one is we provide different templates for our users. So, there are, to your point, there are some visits where you walk in and you're like, I know this is a meaning and purpose visit. I know that's what we're talking about. And so the template that your note comes out in is going to be bending in that direction. And maybe that has to do with content, but it might just be formatting, styling, and the particular kind of sections that we provide in the note. And that might be different than if you're seeing someone for a colon, colon scan kind of follow up. But the thing about a lot of AI products right now is it's not actually one model operating, kind of the whole thing. When we generate a medical note, frequently what we have are 14 to 20 different AI models, all generating different sections. And so, we have, we'll have one section that's an HPI, for example. And it's, if this is what the, provider user wants. Like it can be a really like detailed, very like psychosocial, behavioral, like sensitive, section, or it can be really trim and be focused just on objective data. We also have sections where, we have a different model that generates billing codes. We have a different model that generates the email you send to your patient. So I guess what does the model pay attention to, and how does that reflect what's happening in the room? That's driven by like a bunch of just creating. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, just sorry. Before I let you go too far, when you use the term model, can you clarify maybe what that refers to?
Yeah, so we think
just so I understand the rest of it.
Yeah, totally. So we think about a model as some combination of kind of a like an API and then a set of prompts that are then strung together with very particular extracted data. So what we're like, if you imagine like the model is composed of a few things. It's like the underlying LLM, the relevant medical unstructured information. So that might be, for example, in our software, it's mostly conversation, but it could be the result, a medical document that gets uploaded or something like that. And then several prompts that, involve a description of who the provider is, what their practice is all about, and then what the goal of that particular section of the medical note is. And so each section of the medical note, and each time any kind of output is generated, it's a completely unique combination of all those things. So, I mean, it's a real, like, it's a completely bespoke, totally like never happens again. Like you never are having the same model running again. It's always different. And that's part of the magic of, I give, complete credit to Jackson and Jacob Schalkhauser, our director of engineering, for kind of building this system that has allowed for a really, really wide variance in performance and, in sensitivity, topic wise and formatting and styling wise.
And what the next step there is leveraging one of the, actually probably the best thing that LLMs are good at is extracting data and doing pattern recognition. You think about like, oh, I have 200,000 pages of this thing and I need this certain kind of like information from it. Like that is the best use case ever for an LLM. It's really fast at looking through that and pulling that out. And what we're doing now is we're kind of building that on top of what Nate just talked about, so that when you go and you have a meeting and, let's say the first 5 minutes, it's kind of about this, and then the next 10 minutes, it's about this, we're able to have the LLM look at that and kind of like in a natural language sense, just because it knows what kind of conversation is categorized as what kind of thing, to say, oh, let me take this information and it's the like meaning part of the conversation. We care more about that here, and like, oh, over here this is a physical exam. I just need to figure out like, what did they say that the heart is good? Okay, then give it the good text. Or, oh, they said that this has a problem and now they're talking about it. Let's zoom in on that. Let's figure out more about that. And as we build that and like get more and more layered with it, we're at the point where it's like you pick up the phone and you talk into it just by yourself. Oh, there's no patient in the room. This is just a dictation. We're going to treat that dictation a little bit differently than we are if you're in the room and you're just talking to the patient. Or if you're in the room and you're talking to the patient and their parental guardian or caregiver is also in the room and they're giving input. All these different kinds of things that can come up. It's about just like using the power of these LLMs to categorize, organize, and then figure out what model to bring to bear to answer a particular question and generate a particular output.
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. One of the things that just like within like the history of software that's interesting is software used to be when people talked about some of the like intellectual property within old software, they would talk about business logic or rules. And the way that business logic and rules worked is, your software, in addition to just like having whatever front end people were interacting with, would have like millions of lines of rules about how the software produced whatever it produced. Maybe it produced images, maybe text, maybe numbers, whatever. And when it comes to something as personal as writing, it's really, really hard to come up with rules-based logic to guide, a software product. And so, ultimately, like what what is happening here is, if you imagine like the 20,000 rules that you would need to define in order for someone to write like Zane, what we're doing is we're building a system to make it so that you don't have to choose each rule. You don't have to define each rule. You just interact with our models, and our models adapt and develop what is a kind of settings page that you couldn't in your entire lifetime build yourself.
Yes.
And so that's like the core change to the user experience that's going to happen in software everywhere, over the next few years.
That's fascinating. So maybe you can say a little more about that. Maybe I don't have a complete picture in my head. So the notion that is that a recursive sort of iterative interaction between me and the LLM that sort of builds out that settings page as you described it?
Yeah, that's how we're building it now. So, and that happens in the form of feedback, So when you interact, I mean, it learns from you as you're, editing things and as you're developing these notes, and we find, okay, well, you're really just using this piece of the information more than you're using this piece of information. We see that kind of stuff, but also, it generates an HPI for you. Imagine this, and it's just way too long. You like to keep things short and sweet in your medical notes. Bullet points, really. I don't know how you actually do your medical notes, but for example,
my notes are insane. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, I'm getting a sense. So let's go the other way. It generates it. It just gives you 4 bullet points, and it says, the patient came in with this, they tried this, it didn't work, and they think they're going to do this. And you said they're going to do this, and you're like, this is not detailed enough. So we actually have a literal like thumbs down arrow that you can hit, and you press that, and then a chat bot comes out. And it says, okay, what didn't you like about this? And now you're interfacing with this with language. You're not going into a settings page where there's like 60,000 toggles, and you're like, make it more detailed here. But, especially if it has to do with like pediatric care, you're sensitive to that because of your patient population. That is impossible to do. But when you're talking about it in a natural language way, and you say, hey, this was too short, and it missed the entire thing where we talked about, their dog and like the care that they're giving their dog and how that fits into, their role and how they see themselves as a caregiver. That's important to me. You talk about that with the chatbot, and it says, oh, okay, hold on. And it goes back, we do a little magic on the back end to actually turn that into a prompt that works within our system. You don't see that, though. That doesn't come to the user. That's just kind of like how the software is talking to itself. As a user, you then get a newly generated note that now is a little bit better. It has that sensitivity. It's not in bullet points anymore. It's in paragraph format. And it says, okay, how about this? And you say, great, but, X, Y, and Z. And you kind of just go back and forth with it until that section is looking how you want it to and is more similar to how you would have written it. And then you hit save, and it takes all that and it remembers it. And it says, okay, next time that Zane generates this section of a note in this kind of an encounter, we're going to do this kind of stuff in order to make sure that it's closer to what we know that Zane likes.
Very good.
And we think that, this is what we're doing here, but we're excited because we think all software is going to go this way, because this is what people want. Like we're used to right now, you pick up your computer and like, it does X, Y, and Z, but everyone's dream is that it does exactly what you want. And like, there's always been software that has had, Epic has had 40,000 things in the preference pane. You can make it do exactly what you want, but only real power users are going to get in there and do it. Most people aren't going to do it. It's way too complicated. It's way too hard to set up. But if you can get that level of specificity in all software in a supernatural way where it just remembers and it follows you around, that is like a really nice actual human user experience. And that's what we expect from other humans too. And this is why we talk about like artificial intelligence. There's a reason it's called that. It's because we're kind of like, okay, we created something that is mimicking intelligence. It has a theory of mind, it doesn't actually, but like, we want it to. We want it to understand what we want, even if we don't even know what we want, and other humans can do that for us. And that's what we're trying to do with software development these days.
Yeah. The notion of generalizing it to all software is I'm going to have to take a second to wrap my head around that.
I know it might go overboard at a certain point where you open up Microsoft Word and it's, okay, wait, this is way too specific. Like I didn't need you to do all that for me, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I do. and maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm still wrapping my head around the previous one, so we'll go on the tangent for a second. I think that the challenge of the LLM is, I have, at least in my use of GPT and other things, I have run into sort of the moment where you realize that it doesn't actually have semantic understanding, right? And it was giving you good output and it was useful, and then you hit that moment where you're like, wait. Oh, right. There isn't actually a person there, right? Because I'm asking it something that requires sort of, I don't know, more context or more like to actually know what I'm saying, right? And it's an odd, uncanny valley in some sense where for a while you're able to kind of like fool yourself into thinking, I don't know, that there's another person there, and then you hit that moment where it doesn't work. I think. Side note: so, for instance, one of my examples is the ISIS-2 medical study, where it was the trial, one of the biggest and sort of most impactful trials that we realized that giving aspirin to people who are having heart attacks saved lives. Right. It's one of my all-time favorite studies for several reasons. Number one, it's a huge indictment of medicine because it took 13 years for that to become standard of practice from the time of that study's publication, right? So that's a huge problem in medicine. But number two, the authors only allowed it to be published if they could, because the editors insisted on subgroup analysis. So, hey, we want to do is this true for diabetics? Is it also true for men? Is it also true for women? Is also right? And the author said, we will only publish that data if you also allow us to publish a subgroup analysis by astrological sign. And so, in this very famous paper, there is a subgroup analysis by astrological sign indicating that aspirin does not work for like Geminis and Libras, but works very effectively for Pisces and whatever, right? Wow. And literally they were just making the point that we should not be doing subgroup analysis, but like the editors insisted on us putting this in. So it was just a phenomenal point.
That's
right?
cheeky. That is really,
that's hilarious. I love that.
It's phenomenal.
Or it means that astrology works. That could be the other conclusion of that study.
That could be the other conclusion. That's right. That's right. But you have to bite off one or the other, right?
Is that why I had to put my sign on an intake form? I'm just realizing.
That's right.
That's why they included that.
It's actually, that's the only reason we ask your date of birth. It's actually has nothing to do with it. But yeah, no, I find that fascinating, partly because, when I ask an LLM about that study, it misses the point that they were being, like the astrological thing seems so out of place that it never mentions it, right? Because the intention there was to make a jab at sort of the broader point of how medical science is done, right? And that's a very awkward thing for an LLM to try to quote unquote understand, right? Because it's humorous, it's a jab, it's very sideways. And so the point of it is lost on some level there, right? But it'll happily report the subgroup analysis.
Right.
And so, yeah, that notion of retrieval is phenomenal because, yeah, it will retrieve all the subgroup analysis. And even if you ask it astrological subgroup, it will retrieve that in a very productive and useful and rapid way. But, yeah, it doesn't get that something sideways was being done by intention there.
Right. And that's the whole tension and danger to some degree of these tools. And it's something that, we try to keep in mind because, we're very excited about this technology. And I just got all excited about, what's going to happen with software in general here. But at the end of the day, we're working here in our company with medical information, and it's touching patient care. And one of the things that I think is super important for anyone in this space to remember and like really keep front of mind is these are tools, and right now the way we're designing them is for humans, who have that sensitivity and that context to use. We would never want anyone to just like use this technology as it currently is. Even the stuff that we've made that we're extremely proud of, and we're trying to sell it to you and really want you to adopt it and use it in your practice. If someone asked us, can I just take your note and just plug it right into the EMR so that I just talk and I hit done and I never look at anything again? We would say absolutely not. I'd love to be in a position where I felt confident that, we could provide that software. And who knows, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, maybe we are going to get to a level where we feel confident enough in like the decision making and analysis of stuff. But right now, that's still science fiction. And that's still, kind of a dream. Like the case that we have right now is that, this is a tool to help you with your documentation. It's effectively just a really grand, good summarization process of information that you as the provider are filtering, putting in your own brain, saying with your own mouth, while you're in an encounter with the patient. Those are the cues that it's picking up on and then using to like do the documentation for you. But it is not doing diagnostics, for instance. And this is something that I would love to talk about with you, actually. It's one of the questions I have, which is, we have the very famous case of like radiology right now. The diagnostic stuff that's happening with AI based on images and something where it is like really like pattern recognition driven. And on our end, especially in psych, we make very great pains to say this is not a diagnostic tool. We do not have our model ever try to diagnose anything. If you don't, as the provider, say at some point, oh, we're dealing with major depressive disorder. If you don't say major depressive disorder, it's not going to say, oh, based on, what the patient was saying, we think that they have major depressive disorder. We do not allow it to do that. We have it like explicitly routed to like not do anything like that. But this is something that, it's a larger conversation happening in the medical world, because for certain things, with differential diagnosis, like this is a time-saving tool, or, this is a care outcome increasement that can happen, based on the knowledge of hundreds of thousands of other people that have like had this exact condition, this exact symptom set, and like what they ended up doing. But we're not even sure how we feel about that. And neither Nate nor I are medically trained. Neither of us are MDs.
Sure.
We have friends, family. We're from medical like backgrounds in a way, but only socially. So I'm just curious, to hear from you how you think about this and what you read out of the conversation that's happening around AI and like diagnosing in particular.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that. Yeah, I mean, so first, like with my own little homegrown sort of version that I'm using, certainly time savings are phenomenal. Because I have, yesterday I had an 8-hour visit with a patient, right? So, it was an executive physical. We cover so many different areas. We cover cardiovascular health. We do a strength assessment, mobility assessment, psych assessment, cognitive assessment, brainwave assessment. I mean, and then we get into sort of like meaning, purpose, intention, along with standard medical stuff, right? So, if I were on my own, there's another several hours of trying to write down what just happened, summarize.
Not days.
Yeah, exactly right. And in fact, it's part of the reason I do not use an LLM. I don't. Sorry, an LLM. I don't use an EMR. I basically bought an e-ink tablet and I handwrite my notes in front of the patient. And I mirror that onto a projector behind me so that the patient can see what I'm writing, and we kind of write the note together as we're talking. And at the end of it, I sign my name to it, and that, I mean, it's like it was a reaction to the fact that I can't spend another several hours documenting. The note has to be done at least 80-90% by the time the visit ends, right? Because otherwise there's no way to do it. And so, just using the LLM has dramatically increased my ability to have most of the note done by the time that the visit ends. And I have tried, and with mixed results, adding a little section that has a prompt to say, hey, review this discussion and suggest alternate diagnoses, critiques of my care, or disagreements with, like, specifically prompting it to argue with me and say, hey, you missed this diagnosis, or you should have considered this, or other things, right? Um, and I see on some level, it's an interesting idea, the tension between what you guys can do as a company and what I can do as a doctor for myself, right? Because I'm taking the liability of whatever's in that note because I wrote the prompt, I wrote the code, I did the whole thing, right? So if the AI critiques me and says, hey, maybe you forgot this diagnosis, I'm okay with that. I will communicate that with the patient. I will, if I think it's valid, right? And I review that. Most of it's not valid. And that kind of gets into this notion is that working with an AI, and I've tried this with GPT-4, or at least several times. I haven't tried it with Poe or with Claude recently, but I've tried it with GPT-4, where I give it a case, right? And I talk through, like, hey, this is what it is, this is the symptom, these are the labs, these are the results, X, Y, and Z. And it functions very much the way a third-year medical student or a nurse practitioner functions, right? It gives me a very thin first layer analysis of what things could be, right? It doesn't piece things together, including social constructs or other things. But the value of it is it also is very exhaustive, right? So it will give me even rare possibilities, just the way a third year medical student would do, right? Is, oh, well, maybe this is some, whatever, human HTLV1, some rare virus or whatever. Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. And so the value of, and that's why I think teaching institutions historically have always had better outcomes, is that you have multiple people at different layers of familiarity, different levels of training, looking at the same data, collecting the same data, discussing it, and offering an opinion, which then sort of coalesces to the top of the senior resident, sort of like making a call on whatever, with the attending overseeing or there as a resource to reflect back on edge cases, right? And so the possibility on some level, even right now, without even without speculating on further development, that the opportunity on some level is to start improving outcomes with diagnosis, specifically by having bad diagnoses. Right. So, like, the value of the third year medical student to, let's say, well, why isn't this heart failure? Well, in order to justify that, I have to think a little more carefully about why it's not right. And so,
right, and then it gets you thinking about different things. It's a creative act, really, like what it's causing you to do.
It is exactly right. Right. So almost on some level, I people are talking about, like, oh, can we make it more accurate? I'm like, I feel like that's actually less valuable than what it's currently already doing, where I'm like, I don't want it to substitute for my thinking. I want it to broaden my thinking and tell me where, hey, what is the thing I didn't think of? Because no sane doctor would think of that, but this might be the time it's right.
Zane, I got to tell you, you are holding a contrarian view, not wanting the LLMs to get more accurate. That we love to hear it.
Yeah.
I think.
Sorry, it's actually exactly what you said. Is the more accurate they get, the more we're compressing that bell curve to the middle. So we're all going to be, I one of my early my residency research paper was on this notion of evidence-based medicine, right? Which is a level of standardization, right? Is to say, okay, hey, we're going to follow what the scientific evidence says. And the problem is that if you look back, we would never have invented bypass surgery. We would never have invented, heart-lung machines, because there were decades and centuries of evidence that this didn't work, right? Until it did. And so the problem is that the innovation always happens at the edge of the bell curve, and the more we force people and penalize them from not being at the average, the less innovative our care is. Now, to be fair, you also cut off the bottom, so you also remove people that are. But you don't know, right? You actually don't know. Is this a crazy idea that's going to be the next best thing, or is it a crazy idea that is a crazy idea? And so, yeah, I think the LLMs similarly are kind of like, the opportunity here is we have to choose culturally almost if we allow the LLM to broaden our view and suggest wacky things, well, that gets us thinking versus efficiency of, hey, what's the most average answer I could give?
Yeah. And, I guess 2 points on this. One, the folks who are making these LLMs are really conscious of this. There's this variable called temperature within many of the models.
Yep.
And I'm sure you're familiar with it. But, one way to think about temperature is about how much deviation from a deterministic model you have. Now, a deterministic model would basically be like pure math, right? Like just pure, like input this, you always get, input X, you always get Y. Input X, you always get Y. And what temperature does is it expands that bell curve. It basically like stretches it really, really wide if you make it large enough, so that you do get a more creative, idea-rich, kind of broad understanding of what a possible outcome could be. The other thing I would say is I love how Jackson uses this concept of a tool to think about like what we're building and what every LLM, offspring is. It's really, really important to understand that different parts of medicine call for different kinds of creativity and innovation. One of my favorite companies in the medical space right now is this company called BenchSci. And, are you familiar with BenchSci by any chance?
Nope.
Okay. I think they're an incredible, incredible company. They basically looked at the process of generating new molecules. So, when a pharmaceutical creates a new molecule, typically what they'll do is they'll have this, large bench of researchers. And, the researchers will go to conferences, they'll read papers, they'll talk on the phone to other researchers. They'll they'll have their particular specialty. They'll know certain targets. And based on that, they'll come up with, assay tests, which are basically like Petri dish tests for new molecules. And, to run a good test requires you source the right testing materials, that you build or choose the right molecule to use, as a novel, drug. And then also that you target the right, the right problem, the right indication. So all of that has to go well in order for a drug to go from the assay stage into stage one, or further in clinical trialing. And what they found was that, there are all sorts of misses here. I mean, the most famous one is like Viagra, which was developed, as a drug for, cardiac medicine, and obviously is not famous as a drug for cardiac medicine. But no one really knew that at the assay stage. And that was because the creative act that was required at that stage was limited by the fact that a regular human brain can't spread out as wide as a LLM can if you take, for example, every single academic article that's ever been written about, disease and human physiology, and then say to it, okay, now optimize for molecule creation. So BenchSci is part of this class of companies that is totally changing the way that we prioritize and target with drugs. And, it's something where, the scattered human brain was actually the standard creative practice. And now we're getting to this place where you're getting a step function change, hopefully in drug creation, based on kind of knowing that actually the tool for that creative moment is a machine. It's not like idiosyncratic, like stumbling.
So counterpoint. So this is my, I see a fair, and now we're getting pretty philosophical, but I see a fairly broad pattern in science as a whole that I find very troubling, right? And psych is actually on the forefront of this, which is that science that is hypothesis generating gets far more press because it is exciting, because you're talking about possibilities, right? And the emotional valence of the notion of possibilities opening is exciting. Hey, we could cure Alzheimer's. We could cure cancer. We could, right? The could there is very exciting, makes great headlines, and generates a lot of press. And so there is a tremendous, especially in a social media world, and a grant world, there is a tremendous amount of real value on hypothesis generation. Hypothesis closure or hypothesis, disproving hypotheses gets almost no press by comparison, right? Hey, this drug failed to improve Alzheimer's. That happens a lot, but you don't see those in your feed of all the things that didn't go well, right? And so I think, or didn't replicate, is one of the big things in psychology, right? Hey, we did this experiment again, and it didn't get the cool result we got the first time. It was a null result, right? Um, we see this. I see this a lot with pharmaceutical companies in terms of, hey, our drug doesn't work, right? And so, you know, and there's so much money involved, right? So remdesivir is maybe the most recent example with COVID. Is, you know, the original study as published was supposed to improve mortality. Midway through, they changed the target to shortened hospital stay. Well, because they weren't proving mortality. So they didn't see it. And so midway through, they changed targets. And I guess I just see that AI in general, with a lot of these things, is doubling down on hypothesis generation. Hey, the AI suggests here is a molecule that could help with whatever. We already almost have too many hypotheses. What we need is more work on, well, does it? Did we do a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial? The long-term hard work of like cutting out the stuff that doesn't work. And yeah, I mean, it'd be great if we got to the point where we whatever the percentage of our hypotheses that were true, right? Uh, was a larger percentage, because like you said, the hypotheses quality generation is better. I think that's certainly the dream, but yeah, I don't know. There's just so many unknown unknowns with the human body that you have to do the study. And
yeah, I mean, the dream is definitely a higher yield on clinical trials. Like for a
yeah,
company like
absolutely.
Benchside, the goal would not be like, oh,
Totally.
let's quadruple the number of. Well, I guess
Sure.
it's both, actually. I mean, if you increase your yield on the clinical trial and there's a higher return on capital to spending on pharmaceutical development, you obviously get a higher
Sure.
volume of hypothesis-driven work. Yeah, I mean, I think that reporting on negative results in medicine, a lot of times it depends, you know, on the kind of so what, you know, if a
Mhm.
study fails and no one's on the drug and, um, maybe only investors hear about it. I mean, but investors do hear, of
Sure.
course, about those
Sure.
failures.
Sure.
But, you know, I think about that study that was done that, the study that was kind of a counterfeit study that linked like autism and vaccines. I mean, when
Mhm.
they did a no replication of that, I mean, that was really big news. So there are moments where a negative result in a medical study does seem to get the press it deserves. But I guess one question I would have for you is like, what are some of the negative results that you feel like we're not seeing enough of? What are the things that you feel like the public should know about, that's
Yeah.
kind of being swept under the rug on the other side of the hypothesis process?
Yeah, so here's and I've got several YouTube videos. This is a lot of what my channel talks about. For instance, recently in the press, Gary Brecka has been coming out. He's one of Dana White's with UFC. He's advised him on his health, and you see this a lot with the Huberman crowd, right? Um, and cuts right into the notion of like, well, we can just test everything and then optimize everything, and then your health will be optimal. So there's a molecule called homocysteine, which, if you look at observational evidence, epidemiological evidence, tracks very well with your risk of heart disease, death, blood clotting events. It's actually a great predictor in some sense, right? It can be lowered using B vitamins, relatively not crazy high doses, but reasonably high doses of vitamin B supplements. Um, the problem is that we have done the studies, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, and lowering the homocysteine value with B vitamins does not change your prognostic target. Your risk remains the same as your original homocysteine level, not the adjusted one. So adjusting the lab does not adjust your risk, right? And so that's an important negative result that, hey, look, we have this very, very robust epidemiological correlation, but when we tested for causation, it failed pretty dramatically, right?
Yeah.
Um, Similarly, with the other really interesting. So there's a trial called Orbita. Another favorite trial, which I did a video on, was putting stents in people that have angina, so chest pain from coronary vessel blockage, right? In order to get into the study, you had to have a documented greater than 70% blockage in at least one artery, right? And at least 6 months of ongoing chest pain, which they assumed was due to the blockage. And the trial was you were randomized to either get that blockage stented open or to have a sham procedure in which you were put under they threaded the catheter up, they looked there, and then did nothing. And came back out, and the improvements were the same. There was no difference versus the sham study, right? And so, particularly in surgical specialties, the notion of the placebo effect of a surgery is very, very high. And so,
Really?
yeah, procedural, and again, it maybe speaks to cultural norms or whatever, but procedural. So, for instance, a pill placebo is not as effective as an injection placebo. Is not as effective as a surgical placebo.
That's so interesting. That's fascinating.
So that gets into just like the amount of care that you think you're receiving. Surgery feels like a lot of care. Like, multiple people touched me and they put me under, and money was
spent.
A
cost.
And
the more expensive a pill is, the higher the placebo value, right?
Yeah.
So if you pay $100 for a pill, it's a more effective placebo than a $1 pill, right? Rory Sutherland talks about this. He says, well, the problem is when I have a headache, he's British, so he said I have a 5-pound headache, not a 5 pence headache, right? And so there is that cost value perception that we have, including cost in pain, cost in time, cost in effort, cost in whatever. And so, I got an injection, it hurt me, and even in that pain, there is some placebo effect, as I have suffered for this outcome, right? So yeah, I mean, there's a ton of things. So anyway, in this trial, it was a negative result. Cardiologists have been putting stents in these arteries because they were blocked and they had pain, and when they unblocked them, the pain went away, and they've been doing that for like 40 years, right? So to have a negative study 40 years later to say, hey, that 40 years you've been doing that, it's been placebo the whole time. Right.
Got it. And so is your feeling that like the surgical profession, for example, by and large has not responded to that like negative result, and like we're still actually doing the same thing with stents?
Yeah. So that's, I think each one of these things seems to, on my read of it, fracture the specialty. There are then those cardiologists who basically say, oh, whoops, okay, I'm going to adapt to the new evidence that's come out, right? And then there are the cardiologists who, not consciously, probably subconsciously, say, well, I've been doing this my whole career. It works. It helps. I've seen it help. And I can't let go of the emotional experience of, hey, I had patients who were hurting. I did this procedure and then they weren't hurting. And I can't let go of that on the basis of this study. And every patient is so nuanced, you can find some way in which they don't fit the study criteria, right? And so overall, yes, most cardiologists still, I would say, have not fully adapted to that study. Some have. Some really have said, oh, okay, yeah. And those are probably, again, on that end of the bell curve where they're just mentally more nimble or more aggressive scientifically or whatever it is. But I would say the average has not moved as much as maybe. It's a relatively recently study as well.
But did they break it out by astrological sign? Because if they didn't, I don't know.
That's true. There was not an astrological subgroup analysis. That's true.
Sounds like they got to redo it.
Yeah, that's got to be redone for sure.
Yeah. But one last thing I would like to get into with you here is where you think, because obviously like there is, what I'm hearing in here is like there is such a psychological dimension to care, right? I mean, we
Yes.
talked about that, both from the patient's perception, but also, it sounds like the physician, that's ignored too sometimes, is like, you're a cardiologist, your psychological perception of, oh, well, this is what I come into work and this is what I do. And, I give this thing, they had pain, I do something, the pain goes away. This is what I'm here for, so you have that on both sides. And as we're thinking about the role that AI is going to play in changing healthcare. And I think no one denies that it's not going to change healthcare. It's about how do we want to do it? Which ways are we going to set that up? But I'm just curious really to hear your perspective on where do we let humans start to come out of the loop? Do we at all? Is it only in certain sections? Are there certain places where we're always going to want to have a human there? Are there certain sections where, actually the sooner we get a human out of the loop here, the better it's going to be for outcomes? I'm just curious, like, you must have been thinking about this as we've been sitting in this new AI world for the last year and a half. And I would love to hear the, MD perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my thoughts. I mean, I think, and you touched on, and I didn't fully answer the question on diagnosis, so I can do a 2-for-1 in some sense. Is the diagnostic process genuinely is fairly tricky. As much as we've tried to simplify it, I think that one of the challenges we face is with, and nurse practitioners are, I like to pick on nurse practitioners for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is a tremendous cost savings to the system by using a nurse practitioner in place of a physician. Number two, it is not going to, that choice, that substitution, especially for primary care or care for diabetes or those kinds of things, is not going to budge the average very much. Like a nurse practitioner may in fact improve the average level of care over a physician. It will worsen the care for edge cases, right? And so if your high blood sugars are due to Cushing syndrome rather than diabetes, it's less likely that a nurse practitioner is going to catch that diagnosis because it's a more automated process. And AI, I think, to some degree, doubles down on that movement to the norm, movement to the average, right? So you'll end up with improved care for the middle and worsened care for the edge case.
Zane, sorry, why is that true for nurse practitioners? What's the mechanism there?
Well, my perception is it's because you don't know what you don't know. The theory of a physician, which is never true, but the theory of a physician is that we have the broad picture of all possible diagnoses, at least loaded up somewhere in our head is familiarity with a wide range of illnesses and illness scripts. What does Cushing syndrome look like, right? And we are specifically trained to not necessarily be purely algorithmic in our approach to a patient, but to match what the patient says to a set of possible illness scripts that forms our differential diagnosis, right? And so the process of differentializing, of saying, okay, you're coming in with high blood sugars, that could be diabetes, but it could also be these other things, right? And then you say, well, what if how do we know you have high blood sugars? Well, actually, it's just this one reading. Oh, okay. Well, what if that was a lab error? What would the patient look like now if we take that out? Do we still think they have diabetes? Right? Okay. Well, and those kinds of explorations of like, well, what if I'm very sensitive, and I've tried very, because cognitive error and diagnostic error is actually sort of my pet subject. Is trying to learn to be sensitive to the notion of when am I hinging a diagnosis on a single bit of evidence, because it could be wrong, and what would it look like if that bit of evidence were wrong. So if you're diagnosed pneumonia because the chest x-ray says pneumonia, but the patient has no cough, no fever, their white blood cell count is normal, well, it's less likely that they have pneumonia, right? Possible, but now you're just hinging it on the chest x-ray.
But Zane, doesn't
it's
that
actually
seem like the kind of thing that, at least as I think about AI and like its promise for particularly, the diagnostic thing, it seems to me like it is actually going to be better at suggesting these edge cases. Like you said before, I think to me, and that's where I think the difference really comes down, and it comes down to how we build this. Because if you just let it be like an automatic diagnosing machine, then in order to get it right most of the time, it's going to want to like hew to that middle, like you said, and there's a danger there. But if it is this kind of like assisting tool where it's saying, it's doing the thinking and being like, oh, like, okay, well, what if we take this variable out and check all of this? What could happen there? What if we take this one out and check all of this? What could happen there? And then it says to you like, hey, by the way, you think this is diabetes, and it probably is, but there is this other thing that, there is a 15% chance of it being, and like I've been able to surface this for you, and in a way where it's like your brain that's like thinking about the norms and everything, and also what you're doing today and what you're eating for lunch might not hit upon that, but this like very expansive thing that can check all the possibilities and has access to the statistics and every single thing that's ever happened, even on the far out edge case that only happened that one time in Finland. It has that knowledge and is able to like bring that up and surface it. That's kind of what I think about.
Yeah. And on top of that,
go ahead.
Yeah. I think about this as like the autonomous car question too. Autonomous cars are going to make mistakes. They are going to miss things. And most of what they miss will be edge cases. It'll be like, the kid on Halloween who dresses up in a material that's LiDAR reflective, and they just didn't know, But, when you look at how much challenge there is medicine is a field. I actually can't imagine a field like less ideal for the way the human brain works, like with all its faulty memories and imperfections. When we were first starting this company, we were doing a lot of research of just like, wait, how is medical, like what is medical error? Where does it happen? And we found, for example, that a third of all medical malpractice suits related to medication are just typos. They're not like someone prescribing the wrong thing. It's like, even if you get the drug right in your head, like a third of the lawsuits that are going to come out of it are just because you type it in wrong. And so our feeling is like, there's so much low-hanging fruit in that middle of the bell curve. Yes. There's so much low-hanging fruit. And so, if we are able to be a part of like that early process, as the models become more complex, we're confident that the edge cases are going to get tackled. But that middle of the bell curve, it's something that I think like AI as is going to like completely change quality of care for those 100%. Patients. I also think about, this, so there's one part, which is like, okay, things get more accurate. In the, like when things are median or average, you're getting diagnoses better. There's also a capacity point here too. You talked earlier about this, 8-hour physical exam, this executive physical exam. My guess is that most people who are watching this, like, don't have access to that kind of quality of care. Sure. And, a situation where we decrease the amount of time that physicians are spending, or nurse practitioners or nurses or surgeons, spending doing medical documentation. We would love to get to a point where everyone is getting an 8-hour physical, with a doctor, even if it's a doctor who's doing all the diagnosis after. So capacity expansion is a huge way we think about dealing with median cases as well as edge cases.
So yeah, I think so you brought up two great points there. I do think that so Jackson, to your point, I do think that in the near future, relatively speaking, and we can look to sort of something like meteorology as a model for this, right? AI will improve. It will pick up more and more. It will refine the bell curve of its suggestions to match what we would prefer. How many edge cases does it suggest? How many average cases does it suggest? How well is it matching to our illness scripts? To be fair, I think a lot of these things, because I've looked, right, I've tried to find data. I've found no published data on the relative frequency of X condition, right? There are some like strep throat, right? But most things we try to diagnose, there's no data. So there's a little bit of a problem there, is that the data set is sort of like the physician's subconscious experience of how many times he's seen this thing, right?
Yeah.
There's almost a Bayesian prior constantly being generated by experience, which is not a great method, but I literally like can't find published statistics on some of these things, right? So that's a bit of a problem, but I think that even can be overcome. And what happened in meteorology, which I suspect ultimately will happen in medicine as well, is the AI or the computer in the case of meteorology, the model, um, outperformed, you know, the average meteorologist, right? And really outperformed even above average meteorologists most of the time. However, the combination of starting with the model or several models and then having a meteorologist overread and correct and adjust added another 15 to 20% above and beyond any particular model, right?
That's so cool.
And that seems to be the pattern, not just in meteorology. That's one example. It's probably clearest there, but in general, that seems to be what we see, is that when we have the layer of automation, it ultimately outperforms the average, even outperforms above average, but adding a human on top still gets you another 15 to 20%, because I think of this semantic issue. Is like, well, what does that mean? And you can't quite get there, right? And that little bit of understanding meaning, and all the things you talked about, Nate, you hit the nail on the head. You're hitting all of my favorite topics here. So, one of my favorite examples is from Atul Gawande's book, Better, where he gives examples on hand washing in hospitals, and it's frustratingly binary. If you move from like 50% of people washing their hands to 70%, there's no change in the infection rate. If you move from 70% to 80%, there's no change. If you get above 95%, it drops to zero and stays there, right? And so it's this weirdly, you have to, and the problem there is that it doesn't take a genius to wash your hands. There's no credit, there's no new tech, there's no new it's just diligence. And that is something that computers are better at, right? When I load up a patient's chart in Epic, every single day in the hospital, I have to look at the set of their blood pressures, temperatures, heart rates, blood work, and I have to make sure that I click in all these places to make sure I collect the right set of data on that patient. And if I forget to click in one place on one patient, then I miss the fever that they had, or I miss the, whatever, right? And the diligence aspect of that is extremely low hanging fruit, right? Where, yes, absolutely, an LLM today with no further development really could do a better job of surfacing that information than I do, because, I know for a fact that I miss things, because when I come back in the afternoon and I look, I think, oh, wait, I forgot to look at that. And so I even catch myself, let alone the ones that I don't catch, right? Because it is a mechanical, repetitive process of diligence, extremely low hanging fruit there, right?
Yeah.
And then, now certainly with advancements, I think we'll get to the point where even the diagnostics will really, again, and that's again diligence, right? Is like, hey, did you think of pneumonia? Did you think of whatever? Oh, rare cases, a cough can be a sign of heart failure. Well, it didn't occur to me that day. I know it's in my head, but the patient had a cough and my brain said pneumonia instead of heart failure, right?
No, it's just so clear that the surfacing of this information and just like having access to, you call it the big brain, there's just so many benefits there. But one of the things I'm still thinking about is, there's the gathering of all this. There's the, metabolizing of it and like the diagnosing and the thinking about it. And then there's the presenting of it and the acting on it. And I was thinking about this when you were talking about the meteorologist. Of course, when you're talking about the meteorologist, you're talking about the person in the back room with the charts, writing everything down. But there's also the weather person, on the television. And it is interesting to me because we still like to have that person, right? It's the machine that's doing all the modeling and the calculations and everything, but we still like at the 7 o'clock news to wake up and see that person standing in front of the green screen telling us, hey, it's going to be sunny here, bring an umbrella, and that must mean something. That must really do something for people,
Totally.
We prefer that to just like getting that readout. And I'm not just trying to say that, medical care is the same as, being a weather person, but I just wonder, like, at what level, when people are interacting with their primary care physician, there is going to be that personal touch,
I can
and
give you a
that,
very
yeah,
visceral
please.
example of that. Yeah. It happens not infrequently. Let's say a couple times a year, right? Where a patient comes in and the chest x-ray that they get for their cough pretty clearly is cancer, right? We're it we're pretty reasonably sure that they have a large mass. It looks pretty typical. There's not a lot of questions on the subject, right? The way we talk to the patient about that is, hey, and I'm summarizing this, not exactly, I'm just summarizing, right? The first visit is, hey, we found something on the x-ray. It could be pneumonia, but it looks a little suspicious. It could also be cancer. It could also be a mass. And that's a hard blow. And we acknowledge that. I don't want to jump to any conclusions. There's a huge soft selling that goes, let's get a CT to check it out a little bit more to see whether it's just pneumonia or whether there really is a cancer there. And anytime the big C word comes up, we know that that's frightening. So let's get a CT right away. Let's see what we can do. Right. Okay. The CT comes back, which is the correct next step in the diagnostic pathway. We're not doing anything unnecessary, but the way we present it to the patient is with a greater amount of uncertainty than maybe we genuinely feel. And the reason we do that is so that they have time to adapt to something that is hugely life-changing, right? That uncertainty allows them to process the information with a greater degree of comfort, because, and I'm not leaving them in uncertain, because that would also be cruel. And I think this is something cruel that our system does, is if they're not in the hospital at that time, well, it could be 3 weeks before they manage to get a CT approved by insurance, right? That's awful. But 24 hours of uncertainty can actually be really beneficial. Or overnight, we get the CT the next day, right? Okay, hey, the CT really does show something very concerning for cancer. It's not a slam dunk, could be benign, but it really is concerning at this point. We need to do a biopsy. And the biopsy is the thing that's going to be definitive. Okay, we're going to set you up for the biopsy tomorrow, right? Again, now there's progressively less uncertainty, and that presentation just spread out just a little bit allows them to say, when they first hear the cancer word, it allows them to say, okay, well, maybe it's not certain yet. Oh, but maybe it really is. Oh, but maybe it's not certain yet. And just a couple of hours of that allows them to adapt to that diagnosis more than me walking in the room and being like, dude, you got cancer. It's really bad, right? From the get-go, right? And so that's just one example of kind of saying, and to some degree, we're covering our ass, because there are those edge cases where it's like, oh, it really looked like cancer. It was just pneumonia on the CT. That does happen, right? So that's not a zero case. So there's also, I don't want to scare someone out of that one person. I don't want to scare them out of their mind and then be the dick that comes in and being like, oh, sorry about that, bro. Like, that's a cruel thing to do to someone, right? But there's multiple layers where the presentation layer, as you were kind of pointing out, the weatherman aspect of it makes a huge difference to the patient's ability to cope and figure out where they're going from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of my buddies really emphasizes end of life care when the situation probabilistically is pretty bleak, and being able to sit down with the patient and say, hey, this is your third round of chemo. It's unlikely that a fourth one's really going to do it for you. We can if you want, but what's your quality of life right now, right? And is this really what you want? Those value-based conversations are hard. That's a human to human kind of subjective experience question, right? That's relatively difficult without semantic understanding to really do fruitfully. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
I mean
also
that's a
fascinating. I
hugely
can't I
important.
can't wait to see how this all develops, as we're
Yeah.
like super juicing our, documentation's the lowest hanging fruit here. That's what we're working on, certain kinds of
Sure.
diagnostic, just gathering that information. As we're turning this all up, I really can't wait to see like how the human systems around all of this evolve, and maybe at a certain point, the same way that we think about palliative care now,
Yeah.
you have this moment. Maybe that's going to be somewhat of a model for how like a lot of medical care happens, not just end of life, but maybe a lot of it is actually going to be like in this like very data driven way. And again, hopefully it's in this way that's like bringing in the edge cases rather than just hewing to the mean. But I think the role of the human care provider is only going to increase, as we start to juice everything up with more technology. That's at least my hope.
I do think that there's an interesting social aspect to this, where again, like, okay, if the just using the meteorology example again, right, is that if the AI is able to get to a point where it's outperforming the average physician, right? Well, then the difference between a nurse practitioner and a physician on average is much lower, right? And if you gain a ton of efficiency, how many overreading physicians do you really need to get that extra 10 to 15, 20%, right? Far less.
Yeah.
You don't
Physicians aren't going to
you
like you
need
saying that,
some.
Zane.
Well,
But
yeah, and I mean, I that's
Oh, sorry.
already where we're at, though. I mean, and I really see this honestly. The number of physicians that practice below their level of expertise is very, very high, right? The average family practitioner sees 2,500 to 3,000 patients a day, or sorry, a year, and the average visit time is down to 12 minutes,
yeah.
right? And yeah, if you gave me, I think I'm a great physician, but in 12 minutes I can't do anything. like
Yeah.
I would
You're not
practice
doing
the
the
same way.
executive physical.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not doing anything. I'm not talking about the meaning of life in 12 minutes. Like I'm not, I'm going to do the exact same thing as everyone else. And so the compression of the drop in quality is because of the pressures we've put on the system. Whereas, yeah, if you we're already, I guess what I'm saying is we've already gotten rid of physicians. There are physicians there, but they're not practicing as physicians. They're practicing as poor representations of an algorithm, right?
Hmm.
They're,
That's so
it,
interesting.
yeah. I
So we
mean,
might as well formalize it.
yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. We might as well formalize it, and then hopefully those physicians can actually function as physicians again by overreading the algorithm, right?
Yeah.
That would be a
Yeah.
much better application than having them waste their time being the algorithm, which is what we're doing now, because they have no time to do anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right to point to it as again like a capacity problem. I don't think
Yeah.
there's no like, or maybe there is, but I doubt that there is someone who's like, oh, all these people who we as a society trained for like 12 years, we're gonna make them do these 12-minute sprints that are, not helpful to as they could be. But the sheer amount of burnout, especially coming from COVID,
Yeah.
and particularly with just like how tight hospital margins are. I mean, there is predicted to be somewhere between a 70,000 and 140,000 physician shortage over the next 10 years. I mean, that is
Sure.
a crazy number to think about. And so, whether it's AI or whether it's just cloning physicians, like who knows who gets there first, but like there
Yeah.
has to be a way to expand the capacity of physicians because otherwise, we're going to be down to like 7-minute visits at some point, or just a really stratified, healthcare system where some people are, have the privilege to kind of work with you, and the rest of us are, kind of, going through some really really industrialized healthcare process that, it's super depersonalized and not as thorough.
I will say, I mean, I do think we are headed there, and whether AI pulls us out of that or not, I don't know,
Mhm.
right? But I very much see, the best physicians I know are moving to cash only, are not taking Medicare, are not, not even taking insurance to some degree. That's a pretty big movement, right? And so, yeah, that ultimately that worsens the shortage, and you're going to end up with nurse practitioners fulfilling that role, which are even more algorithmic in their approach, right? Those are truly just representatives of the algorithm in a very powerful way. And so, yeah, you end up with a two-tiered system on some level, right? Where the people who can afford cash to actually see a physician do, and the rest are, in the general insurance healthcare pool. And I'm talking about outpatient medicine now. Inpatient medicine's its own beast in so
Right.
many ways. Which, by the way, we can talk about. It might be interesting from a documentation standpoint, actually, as well. Circle back around there, but yeah, on the inpatient side, and that's where I saw it most dramatically. Is I on the inpatient side, I never felt, because the patient's captive, so I never felt like I was doing less than my best or forced to do less than my best until hospital systems started asking me to see 25, 28 patients a day. And then I started doing less than my best, and I saw myself cutting corners because, well, I left at the end of the day being like, I hope I remembered everything, because I shot from the hip basically for 12 hours or 14 or
Yeah.
16 hours. And, and then you make weird trade-offs, right? I came in at 6, I left at midnight. Okay. Should I have stayed till 2? Should I have stayed till 6? Like, when do I sleep? Right. There's these weird trade-offs. And now you cut out documentation from that, and yeah, maybe I could see 20, 25 patients. Right.
And that's where we're trying to make that intervention right now, because, we see this. We see that it's this like two-tiered system, and we see a lot of that is driven in particular because of physician burnout. They just say, I can't deal with this. I'm not giving my best care here. So that's one of the things that we hope that we're doing is we're saying, hey, this documentation thing that takes up so much of your time and is kind of the absolute worst part of your job. Let's just get that squared away. Let's help you get it through it faster. Let's make it more accurate. Let's make it, more consistent across different providers inside of a system. And then hopefully, when you go into the room to see the patient, instead of sitting there trying to like do the concurrent note where you just type, ask the question, go over, ask the question, you're looking the patient in the eye again. That's something that we like to say that a lot of our customers are having that experience where they say, it's amazing. I go in, it just listens, and then I'm just talking to the patient, and then afterwards the note's done,
Yep.
And we're hoping that, that intervention, at this small scale right now in outpatient medicine is going to find its way also to inpatient medicine, and hopefully just relieve some of the pressure on the system that's just being bombarded at all sides.
Can we randomly brainstorm this, just because I've been trying to puzzle it over in my head? I'm curious to hear y'all approach the same problem. Inpatient medicine is both harder and easier than outpatient from the perspective of AI documentation, right? And so harder because the conversation is not truly episodic. Like, I will talk about all 18 of my patients at random times over the course of that 12 hours, right? I'll run into the cardiologist in the hall, and he'll tell me, oh yeah, Mr. Jones, I'm going to do a cardiac cath on him tomorrow. And Mrs. Smith, she's fixed. She can go home and whatever. Right. And then I'll run into the nurse, and she'll tell me 5 things that are happening with 3 other patients. Right. So it's challengingly non-episodic for the auditory record to match to the patient, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a really difficult problem. And
super difficult.
One of the things that we're seeing, software try to approach it with is trying to get that information in different ways, right? So it's not just like that one single audio recording, but if you can record the audio from all these different people that you haven't even had an opportunity to like interface with, but there's a machine that's able to quickly summarize that, take it in, mix it with the patient's previous information, the information that the patient put on their intake form, the information from their last 3 medical notes, and then that can kind of all get synthesized together. We see it kind of as like, again, one of the things that we know that AI is the best at is surfacing information. extracting the thing you need to know from somewhere, whether it's the big brain database or whether it's the audio thing that's happening in a different room of the hospital at the same time, getting that information and just getting it to the right person at the right time. And that's where software comes in again, and that like user experience that we talked about before. I think that that's actually one of the most exciting things in this whole space right now, is like all this disparate information that's being spoken, typed, thought in all these different places. How do we get it so that it is where it needs to be in order for the right person to see that and then make the right decision at the right time?
Yeah. Like at an intermediary level, or an intermediate level, what you're probably going to see is, for example, the marriage of EHR systems and systems like ours, so that medical notation, prescription, diagnostic tooling, if that's something that doctors want to use for middle of the bell curve or edge cases, is a synthesis of audio data as well as the biopsy you're referencing, or a CAT scan or something like that. When you think about the future utopia, I think there's a question of privacy and there's a question of hardware. So, the hardware question is, look, if I'm passing you in the hallway and we need to have like a conversation about, Jackson or something like that, do I have like a little button that I press on my chest that then records our conversation? Yeah. So, that's a hardware question. And then there's a privacy question too, because you could fathom a world in which you walk into, I could see this in emergency rooms, for example. You walk into the premise of an emergency room and you just know you're being recorded. Everything is being recorded. And the big brain that Jackson's talking about is actually like this orb of like consciousness that the building has inside of it, that is then dealing out information to you, like, as you go through your day. I mean, Jackson and I, when we dream, we talk about the keyless EMR as being like this brain that becomes the central spinal cord of our health system, where you're never typing, you're never like even audio inputting things in this conscious way. It's just a presence with you. It watches you. It it listens to you. It gives you advice from kind of from speakers, surrounding you. Mm-hmm. Maybe it neurolinks into your brain. Maybe you've got special goggles that like feed you information that's coming from it. The possibilities of kind of like the hospital of the future are massive, but they're not technologically limited. The limit is it's really in our conception of privacy, and it's in our conception of like, what hardware do we want to engage with?
I think I do have questions on the notion of that implementation, and this circles back even to our discussion about diagnostics and stuff like that, in that a lot of my views, for instance, are pretty counterintuitive, or at least countercultural, right? So I think I have good science basis for them, but the cultural narrative is a bit different, right? So my latest video was on full body MRIs and why those are a bad idea, right? And the error rate on them is too high, right? But then once you have an MRI that says something, you're kind of stuck with it, right?
Right.
And so I do wonder, to some degree, as LLMs are able to surface all this data, how much propagation, because we see this actually already, how much propagation of erroneous results happen, right? I'll read a whole bunch of studies, I'll realize, and this literally has happened, is I realized that this study was actually read on the wrong patient, right? Because it doesn't match any of the other studies that were done like even a month later. Like, and it's true, okay, their echo showed that the heart was functioning perfectly. The one the month before and the one the month after showed it was at like 5%. Well, there's no way that for 1 month it was perfect, right? That's just not possible, right? But depending on how the search happened and how the data was surfaced, right? People will quote, well, they had a good echo on this day, and it's like, whoa. that clearly doesn't make any sense. That's just one example, right? Or right. An MRI shows a tumor, the biopsy was normal, but the tumor was there. Now, once you have the biopsy, an AI will absolutely surface that. That's obvious, right? But in between, there's this question of like, well, there was this result. Are we saying that's the cause of their abdominal pain, or is there something else going on, right? So those kinds of things I think still need to be worked out. But yeah, I mean, those are also cultural issues, right? Is how much do we trust our technology? How much do we trust results? And then you're exactly right. The issue of privacy. How comfortable are we being recorded? Who's managing that data? How is it being owned or operated, or how does it affect the ads I see? How does it affect all these other aspects of what happens with data?
Yeah, and that is its whole own podcast of conversation that
So I do
absolutely needs to happen.
I know we probably need to wrap up here in a second, but I wanted to give some space and loop back around specifically to you guys' product, because I want to, if there's anything talking about maybe the early results y'all are seeing, or the implementation, or future directions, or just give you some space to maybe talk focally about SmartScribe.
Yeah, sure. Let's just I'll put my tie and salesman hat on, and I'll let Nick
go
great.
Well, we started with my salesman hat, so we'll end with y'all's salesman hat.
I mean, I guess I'll give an overview of where we've come, and then Jackson has kind of the most clear-eyed and exciting view about where we're going. But, we started this company with a really simple goal, and that goal was to reduce documentation time by 90% for doctors, for nurses, for nurse practitioners, for therapists, for social workers. And what we found, we've created we've recorded and synthesized around 7,000 patient visits so far. And what we hear from users is that, this technology is giving them back hours every day. I mean, for a lot of folks who are doing 2 to 3 to 4 hours of documentation every day, to reduce that by 80 to 90%, completely changes their life. And, I think we have kind of a funny story that we kind of went through recently. We were at a medical conference, and we're scrappy, so we had gone down, not having purchased a booth or anything like that, and we were standing on the sidewalk handing out cookies. We had like this box of Safeway cookies and these flyers, and we had this shtick where we would say oh, take a cookie, and when they say no to the cookie, we'd be like, oh, but the flyer, it's 0 calories, and and then people kind of they feel bad for you because it's such a bad joke, so they take the flyer. But we at that conference, we the person who ran the conference came out and was like, hey guys, do you mind kind of clearing the sidewalk? And so we were walking away, and as we were kind of departing the front of this, entrance, which we'd kind of been loitering and soliciting at, this bus pulled up, and one of our very first customers walked out of the bus, saw us being escorted out, and just looked at this whole group of people there and said, this software changed my life. And it was this really, it was a magical moment.
That's amazing.
It was so cool. So that's where we're at right now. Right now we have accomplished the mission of saving, 90% on, physician and nurse practitioner time within the behavioral health space, but we've got so much more planned. And yeah, Jackson's kind of the captain of that path going forward. So I'll let him talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, that it's basically that, we want to save people time, and people save more time when they feel like they have to, supervise it a little bit less, and that they have to edit a little bit less, and that, every incremental change that we make, we talked about this customization we're talking, earlier, that's really where we're going with this, so that you, the provider that is used to doing your notes a certain way, you adopt this tool that's helping you automate that process, and you don't have to make as many concessions anymore. Because that tool learns how you do your note, how you like to do it, how you like to interface with your patients, how you set up your EHR, and the closer it gets to that, and the more seamless that transition is from you spending 2 hours writing yourself to you spending 15 minutes checking this over and then being done with it, the more seamless we can make that, the more people are going to adopt it, and the more, time people are going to save. And it's not just the time saving, it's also, it's really the care too. I really want to come back to that eye contact thing, because it's so important to me. There's nothing worse than the way you feel when you go and you see and you have your 12-minute appointment and you're just I am just a number in the machine here.
Yep.
like they have to, and you have sympathy for them if you understand how much of a burden medical charting is. I'm like, I don't want them going home and spending 3 hours on their couch and, ruining their family life for my sake. But I also want them to look at me and like actually talk to me and not just be writing over here. So those two things, being able to reduce those and, just kind of like connect people with their patient and give providers their time back. I mean, it's like super exciting.
I think that's incredible. And by the way, I may end up cutting this back up to the front just because we jumped into the conversation, I think. But I think this notion that, you can, as you said, look the patient in the eye, have the conversation recorded, and then have that conversation automatically generated into a note that represents first, I mean, maybe even the first pass is just an average note, but then have that note progressively refined into how you like to have notes done. I think that's a super interesting opportunity. And I did want to ask, we touched on this before, but that refinement process is like you say up yes or no, I didn't like this section, and then you enter a chatbot, talk to the chatbot about what you didn't like, right? And maybe I missed that. The chatbot then updates the prompt. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's our secret sauce in the background
Okay.
there, like how it actually gets from that into like what works there. But it is, essentially the chatbot plus some of our own software is doing that prompt engineering in the middle.
Okay.
We talked about like,
Cool.
the difference between the prompt engineering and the fine tuning there. We're actually not taking like patient data and like doing fine tuning of models. We're just taking like preference data from that and like adjusting the way that the prompts are happening at a technical level for now.
Very cool. No, but still that I can very well imagine improves the experience of the provider, and thereby, because then again, you're cutting out time, right? So it's like, oh, well, the closer the note matches what I want, the less editing I have to do to that note to get it to its final form. Well, if that's iterative on the prompt, then yeah, I can readily imagine that's pretty special.
Zane, if
Absolutely.
I can just, one of the things that we always say to people is it's really hard to imagine how great this technology is, even out of the box. Obviously we want to create all this customization, but out of the box, this technology is, it's Lord of the Rings grade special and like surprising. I think that what we would say to, your listeners and your audience is, you can try Jot Psych for free for 7 days without swiping a credit card. Just go to jotpsych.com and you can download our software in 3 minutes. You don't even have to download it. It's just a website. And experience the wave of the future. Experience what it's like to have a full-time scribe who never sleeps and never leaves you for medical school, and and takes feedback very earnestly. So that's the best way to kind of see what we're building and to to get engaged with it.
Awesome. Even if you're not in a behavioral health specialty. Yeah, I just want to note that too. I mean, we're built primarily for behavioral health right now. It's called Jot Psych. But if anyone's listening and they just want to try it, we do have templates that, they're not going to be as specialized as our like therapy and our like psychiatric intake templates. But we do have the ability for you to just, try it with like a generalized SOAP note too and see kind of how that goes. But yeah, our cost is we're $150 a month per provider. And that is, month to month. So we don't do an annual contract. There's no upfront fee for anything. You sign up for that. You use it for a month. If you're not liking it, let us know. We're going to take that feedback and keep improving the product. But you're free to cancel. We're not locking you into anything.
Honestly, it's funny how much that to me for SaaS is a mark of confidence, right? Is a company that's not trying to lock you, and maybe because it's so typical in the medical space to have like a ton of upfront costs and then like lock in and all these contracts. For truly, as you guys said, life-changing products, it just speaks for itself, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying so, and we hope that you and anyone listening is going to try it out and let us know what they think.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we have tons more we could dive into, but you guys have already been very generous with your time. So,
Zane, thank
We'll
you
just
so
have to
much
come
for
on
having
again.
us.
my pleasure.
Yeah.
Truly my pleasure. I mean, thank you guys for coming on. I'm really excited. Love to have you again, actually. So, we'll dive even more into any of these topics in the future. So,
Yeah, and
right,
Zane,
thanks, Zane.
just want to say thank you so much for the time today. And I also, do want to also say thank you to the other members of the team. I mentioned Jacob Schalkhauser, who's done a huge amount of the engineering work here, as well as just all the doctors and the patients and the nurse practitioners who have given us advice along the way. Like we couldn't do any of this without the community, surrounding us. So, credit goes where credit's due.
well, that's the interview. If you liked that, why don't you check out this video of my interview with Udi Merav, CEO and founder of Caliber Biometrics, creating the Caliber device, which is the #1 fitness wearable of 2024. Check it out.